How did Wisconsin end up with a medieval-style stave church?
Let's explore this impressive architectural structure.
When visiting Washington Island, Wisconsin, the Stavkirke is a must-stop at any time of year. We talked to the man who probably knows the most about this building.
My name is Richard Purinton, Washington Island, Wisconsin. I put a book together 2017, 2018 as a kind of a commemorative book with a lot of historical information on why the church was built, how it was built, who was involved, and then it also gets into how it's been used since it's been dedicated and constructed. I think it's an interesting story for many people who visit here because there aren't too many of these Stavkirkes in the United States. There are a few, but not too many. The word Stavkirke, Kirche is church, and there are many similar words. German is Kirche. Stav refers to the upright columns or masts, and there happen to be 12 of them here. These are the primary supports of the church, and among the first major elements of the church to be erected, and then the rest of the church is more or less built around that. So there were some of the masts that were cut from the island. A few were cut from Northport. Basically, all the rest is white pine from northeastern Wisconsin. These can be referred to as masts or staves, upright pillars, and that is a commonality among all of these stave churches built in Norway. This church was patterned after the church in Borgund. Borgund Church does still exist in Norway. It's perhaps just slightly different in the footprint and the scale, but very close. At one time, there were probably close to 1,500 churches in the somewhat isolated fjords and valleys of Norway. Today, I think there's probably a couple of dozen. That might be all that remain for a number of reasons, but natural deterioration being one. And it costs money, of course, to maintain those structures, but those that still exist, coated heavily in pine tar, which helps them to weather the elements. So some of them are 800-900 years in age. Washington Island happened to be settled first by Irish and German people, and then added to that were Yankees, people who came from out east, many of English origin, or from Canada. But about 1850, there was an influx of Norwegians, so it reflected somewhat on the economic times in Norway. People looking for better life, for opportunity, for farmland. So within a matter of a decade or so, Norwegians and the Norwegian influx seemed to outnumber those of other nationalities. These folks would write back to relatives, inviting them to join them, sometimes giving glowing reports, sometimes not, but that led to more immigrants coming to Wisconsin, many coming through Milwaukee, and then north to Washington Island. Fishing, of course, was an occupation that seemed to suit both Norwegians, Danes, and Icelanders quite well, but they also became farmers, dairy farmers, small farms here on rocky Washington Island. I think few people really knew of these churches, knew what they were about, how they were built, but we had a pastor here in the mid-1980s, Jim Reif. He had been involved in a project, or his brother had, in Minnesota. He thought it would be a great way to honor Scandinavian heritage here on Washington Island. So he proposed building a Stavkirke. It took a little bit of persuasion. People had to learn what he was talking about and then kind of get behind the project. There were always other things that were high on the list with the church that probably struggled to meet its annual budget. But the church is owned and managed by Trinity Lutheran Church, the Church of Stone, which is just across the road. There's a property here, approximately 10 acres, that's also managed, and volunteers do the work. I'm one of the volunteers. A project of passion and outreach, I think you would say. The notion took hold, the motion was passed to go ahead with it, and then there happened to be many donations that came in, both from church members and outside the immediate church. Now, the actual design of the architectural elements were provided by Pat Mangan, an architect from Sister Bay. He always had a fondness for this type of church, and he visited a number of them in Norway. So he provided the plans. I must say that the plans and material list did not come with erection drawings, how to put this thing together. So two of the island carpenters, John Hirschberger and Dale Bjarnson, were the head carpenters. They were involved in other building projects at the time, but they spent a couple of mornings a week. Later on, as the project went on, they intensified the time spent here. If you turn and look toward the back of the church, up high on the right, there's a tool belt, and that belonged to Dale Bjarnson. Now, each time he finished work here, he would hang his tool belt up and not worry about it until he came back the next time, which was perhaps a few days later. Late in the construction process, he passed away. And so his partner, John Hirschberger, just left it there and has remained there ever since. And they had help from volunteers. And so that's how it was put together. The foundation was actually put in 1991. Kind of sat for a little bit as the floor joists were added and so on. But by late 1992, construction was underway in earnest. Then by 1993, the two carpenters put up a kind of a shed, painted red like a barn, large enough to cover nearly all of the Stavkirke, so they could work inside in the wintertime and in wet elements and so forth. At the very last, they had to poke a hole through the top of that shed to go all the way up. Within a few days of its dedication, that outside shell was taken down, all the materials were piled on a wagon, hauled away, then the building was dedicated. So we kind of give an official finish to the church as being August of 1995. There were other things added afterwards, including in 1999, there was another level to the cake, so to speak, placed on top with an aerial lift that was constructed off-site. Some people have asked, is it true that there are no bolts or nail screws? No, that's not true. Perhaps there were a few that were built only with wooden pegs or trenails, tree nails as the English used to call them. But here, just as a practical matter, there are metal fastenings. For the most part, you're not going to see them because they may be covered with a wooden plug. If you look up in the very peak, you can see a couple of places where the bolts have been fastened and then covered over with a wooden cover. And on the outside, that gave it a nice, very pleasing height and proportions, which almost all Stavkirkes have. The use of wood, nicely styled proportions, and this takes its cue from those buildings constructed years and years ago. The type of construction, very thick planks, heavy material. These churches were built to withstand snow loads as well as high winds, and we haven't had any issues here on this church other than perhaps a few errant woodpeckers finding a choice selection of the corners of the building, so we've had to have some concern about that. The materials themselves did not come just from Washington Island. In fact, probably very few of the materials were island origin. Basically, all the rest is white pine from northeastern Wisconsin. Algoma Lumber Company, which does a lot of logging and sawing of timber, they were given the material list, so they sawed the lumber. It was brought up by truck to the island, stored for a number of years until the two carpenters were ready to go ahead with the project. Now, the one exception to the white pine are the shingles, which are cedar, white cedar shingles. And they were furnished by a couple that has a mill in northern Wisconsin. And the request was that they be 4 inches wide. Now, when they make cedar shingles, they don't come in convenient 4-inch widths. They have some like that, many in between, and they need to sell it all as shim material or something else, but we needed just the 4-inch material. And then different folks on the island took them home, trimmed them in a bandsaw, so the shape that you see on the roof now was imitated by all those people who worked through boxes of shingles till they had enough to cover the entire roof. Then the entire exterior was coated with a stain which has a pine tar component. It's not as rich and as dark and as heavy as that used in Norway, but it has a good waterproofing effect. And that stain has to be reapplied about every 5 or 6 years, particularly the side toward the west, which receives the most sunlight. The dragon heads on the exterior are very well made replicas of the actual dragon heads that were on the Stavkirke in Borgund, Norway. When these churches were built, it came at a time when Christianity was replacing, but slowly displacing paganism. And people still believed in dragons as not something to be feared necessarily, but to help ward off evil spirits. So they didn't go completely toward Christianity. They wanted to keep perhaps 1 foot in their old pagan beliefs. And if you look at a carving, so there's one over the door behind, there's an element there of dragon head also. That's a design from a Viking carving book. Those sorts of elements were not completely done away with. They had both for a period of time. And then as the years, centuries went by, this type of carving, a much fancier, refined rose-mauling type carving called acanthus carving, took its place. And the carving by Gary Hendrickson, which is on the altar, using the acanthus plant as the basis for the swirls, very elegant type of carving, became popular by 1600. The pictures that I've seen, and I've also been in a couple of Norwegian Stavkirkes, they're very, very ornate in both carvings, paintings, and use of gilding on many surfaces. One could almost say overly done to some extent. They really went all out. This is over centuries, of course. I think this will always remain simpler just from a practical matter. I don't know that anyone wants it decorated, overly decorated, but it probably won't happen in any case. This wording in Norwegian is, "He is arisen." And then there is a faux marble painting. That's pine painted to look like more special marble. And then there's also some acanthus carving on the top of the altar. All the other carving pieces I've done, I've been involved with it early on. I wasn't a carpenter, but I did become a wood carver, and it would be called flat carving. And I've used Celtic, Norwegian symbols. They're pretty much one and the same because they borrowed back and forth the type of artistry that they found both in jewelry and coins and in their carvings, even in tombstones. So I've done those over the course of the winter, as well as the crosses up above, St. Andrew's crosses, those are called. Those are designs that I've picked up either from books or in some cases, such as the crosses, I got that design from an individual in Iceland. The ship that is above your head is a model of a Mackinaw schooner, double-ended sailing vessel, very popular on the Great Lakes in the 1800s, up until the time that gasoline engines were being installed in boats. But these sailing vessels, usually 30 feet and under, were used for hauling people, goods, livestock around the lakes, and also for fishing. And when small gasoline engines came into being, then many of these older Mackinaw boats, the ones that were still in good service, had these engines installed in them. So that's an important historical feature, but it's also commonplace in communities that depend upon the sea or waters, in this case Lake Michigan, for both sustenance and transportation. And certainly this island is very much dependent upon transportation, ferry service, as well as other freight vessels that used to ply the waters here. So that's to bring blessings on those who need to make their living and transportation by sea, by lake. To add to that, there is a prayer path that goes around through the woods, just the adjacent woods, maybe a third of a mile in length. Recently, a couple of years ago, there was a parking lot constructed down in the lower area there to the west so that buses, tour trains, cars, and whatever goes on the road could come in and park without being out along the busier town line road. And then last year, there was an idea for a labyrinth, so that was constructed and completed. I think it was in early September. So before you go, you might want to take a look at that. Always open to everyone. It's part of an outreach of Trinity Lutheran Church. I don't know if anyone had a real strong idea of what it might mean in the future. Certainly it became a tourism objective for many people who visit Washington Island. This is something that they would like to visit before they move on to the next thing, whether they're, young adults, couples with children, older folks, whatever, tours. So it has actually fulfilled a role as a tourism destination, but it is a dedicated church, and I think there's a real difference in that. I think it was in early August of 1995, I was church council president at the time. This was dedicated as a Lutheran church. So, in other words, there can officially be worship here. Although it's primarily open night and day, doors always open. There are the occasional weddings and special services. There was a Christmas Eve service. I think it was at 11:30 in the evening. I'm not sure how many people were here. I was not, but there's also an Easter Vigil service. And numerous baptisms and weddings, things like that, scheduled throughout the year. When those special events occur, then we ask that the public try to respect that and refrain from coming in during that time. But otherwise, for services and for viewing, it's always open. In my book, I've noted the number of pastors and a little bit of a narrative by each one of them as to what the Staff Church meant to them, their part at Trinity Lutheran Church. So I think everyone takes something a little different away from the experience, but I would conduct tours, take people around in a tour tram. There are people from all over the world, and I would give a little introduction before we entered the path from the Town Line Road to say that we're coming to visit a wooden church, Norwegian replica. I wouldn't give them a great deal of information, but just enough. And invariably, when people reached the opening where they could see this, they were, in many cases, breathless. It really kind of took them back. And I think it became a very respectful experience. And this is for people who I know were not necessarily of Christian background. They entered the church with a great deal of respect. We're very thankful, I think, for the experience. Something about it struck them, and maybe it was simply the look of the building. It might have been something else that became a spiritual experience for them. So if that's the case, then I would say the purpose of the church has been fulfilled.
We were impressed by what we saw.
You may have noticed a face carving. This represents Christ's presence, and the carvings are often placed in these churches during early stages of construction. That interesting fact comes from Richard's book. You can find the book at various spots on the island, including Trinity Lutheran's office and the local bookstore. It can also be found at Al Johnson's in Sister Bay. Proceeds help to maintain the Stavkirke.
Door County has plenty of cool attractions, including this great spot.